At 5:47 on a Saturday evening in October of 1998, the city of Detroit pressed a button and erased a century, 25 stories, 2.2 million square feet, a building that once held the world's tallest department store, the world's largest American flag, 200 departments selling 600,000 items from 40 countries, 5 restaurants that serve 16,000 meals a day, and the memories of every family who'd ever walked through its brass doors on Woodward Avenue, gone in 30 seconds. The explosives roared like thunderclaps, rapid, sequential, mechanical, ripping through the J.L. Hudson building floor by floor. Glass quivered in the southwest corner. Then the structure began to move, not falling exactly. Not at first. It wobbled, hesitated, as if the building itself wasn't sure this was really happening, as if 107 years of standing on that corner of Woodward and Gratiot entitled it to one last moment of defiance. And then it gave way. The 25-story tower twisted sideways and careened into the pile of shattered brick and concrete beneath it. And a roar went up from the crowd. 50,000 people gathered at Hart Plaza and the Wayne County building steps and the windows of surrounding offices, some watching from across the Detroit River in Windsor, Ontario. They cheered. For a moment they cheered. Then the dust came, a brown-gray cloud, 300 feet high, rolling south and east across downtown, swallowing blocks and streets and people and cars. Spectators who'd been standing a block away turned and ran as silty darkness enveloped them. Fox 2 anchors Huel Perkins and Monica Gale were engulfed on live television, the camera feed turning to gray nothing. An inch of powder coated everything for blocks in every direction. Windows shattered in buildings across Woodward. Steel beams crashed onto the people mover track overhead. And when it finally began to settle, that impossible cloud, carrying the pulverized remains of a building that had once employed 12,000 people and welcomed 100,000 customers a day, what was revealed was a 60-foot pile of rubble, 660 million pounds of brick and steel and concrete where a palace had stood that morning. Someone in the crowd said it first, a woman from Ann Arbor named Safia Khalid, standing in the dust, looking at the void in the skyline where the building had been. "Hudson's was the heart of downtown," she said. "This is a sad, historic moment." Another spectator, Annie Clean from Pleasant Ridge, put it more simply, "a hole in the skyline." But someone else, an observer whose name didn't make the papers, described what happened in the seconds after the cheering stopped, and what they wrote has stayed with everyone who read it. The cheering had stopped as the immense reality of the event sobered all who viewed it. An emptiness followed, and the guilt of our cheers weighed upon us. The choking clouds dissipated, and a ghastly scene was revealed. An inch of dust covered everything for blocks around, and there, in the midst of it all, lay the smoldering and shattered heart of 20th century downtown Detroit. The Detroit News ran its story the next morning. It called the building a symbol of glamour for 3 generations, a symbol of decay for another. It described how the structure had wobbled like a drunk, hesitated, then collapsed. But the detail that mattered was the time, 5:47 p.m., the store's traditional closing time. They brought it down at closing. And what's strange, what you don't expect watching the footage, is how fast it happens. You spend months learning about a building that took 35 years to construct, that was built in 12 stages between 1911 and 1946, that grew floor by floor and wing by wing until it covered an entire city block and rose higher than any department store on earth. You learn about the escalators and the elevators and the flag and the parade and the Morris salads on the 13th floor. You learn about the doorman who stood on the Woodward sidewalk and the children who met Santa in Toyland and the women who worked the perfume counter and the drivers who delivered packages in 300 trucks across metropolitan Detroit. And then you press play and it's over in 30 seconds. How do you mourn something that disappears that fast? You start at the beginning. You start with a man who lost everything and built it all from nothing on a street nobody thought would amount to much. Joseph Lothian Hudson was born in Newcastle-on-Tyne, England, in 1846. He was 9 years old when his family crossed the Atlantic, first to Ontario, then south into Michigan, where his father found work, and Joseph found the trade that would define his life. He learned to sell clothing. He was good at it. By his 20s, he was working in Pontiac, Michigan, for a man named C.R. Mabley. And what Hudson absorbed there, about quality, about service, about treating a customer like someone you'd see again next Saturday, became the foundation of everything that followed. But before the empire, there was the failure. Hudson and his father opened a general store in Ionia, Michigan, a lumber town, dependent on the sawmills that kept the money moving. It worked for a while. Then the panic of 1873 hit. The sawmills shuttered. The customers couldn't pay their bills. And then Hudson's father died. Joseph Hudson went bankrupt. He paid his creditors 60 cents on the dollar, everything he had, and he was done. 29 years old, broke, alone, starting from nothing in a state that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. What Hudson did next tells you everything about the man. He moved to Detroit. In 1877, C.R. Mabley, his old employer, hired him to run the largest men's and boys' clothing store in the city. Hudson ran it well, but he and Mabley couldn't agree on how a store should be operated. Hudson had ideas about what a customer deserved. Mabley had different ideas, so Hudson left. And on April 2nd, 1881, he opened his own shop on the ground floor of the old Detroit Opera House. Men's and boys' clothing. A modest space. A modest start. But here's the part of the story that explains what Hudson's would become. Not just a store, but a promise. In 1888, 7 years after opening his shop, Hudson tracked down every single creditor from his Ionia bankruptcy. Every person he'd shorted when the sawmills closed, and his father died, and his world fell apart. He found them one by one, and he paid them back in full, with compound interest. 12 years after going broke, he made them whole, not because anyone forced him to, not because there was a legal obligation, because he believed that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt at personal cost, or it meant nothing. That instinct, that a man's word and a store's reputation are worth more than the money it costs to protect them, became the DNA of the J.L. Hudson Company. It would show up decades later in a return policy so generous it bordered on absurd. In 1952, the store recorded $175 million in total sales and issued $25 million in refunds. Store executives didn't blink. They called it a small price to pay for customer loyalty. But that was later. In 1881, Hudson was just a man with a small shop in an opera house, selling trousers and shirts in a city that was beginning to boom. Detroit was growing. The automobile industry was stirring to life, still years from the assembly line. But the engineering talent and the entrepreneurial hunger were already converging on the city. Fortunes were being made, families were arriving, and Joseph Hudson, the bankrupt Englishman who'd paid back every penny he owed, was positioned at the center of it. By 1891, the shop in the Opera House wasn't enough. Hudson moved his store north to a new location at the corner of Woodward Avenue and Gratiot, a spot that nearly everyone in Detroit's commercial district thought was too far from the action. Jefferson Avenue was where the money was. Woodward, that far north, was a gamble. Hudson took it. He was also, it turned out, more than a clothier. He sat on the boards of banks and gas companies. He chaired Detroit's associated charities, laying the groundwork for what would become the United Way Foundation. In 1893, when the Third National Bank of Detroit collapsed in another financial panic, Hudson felt personally responsible. He paid depositors out of his own pocket, $265,000, over $7 million in today's money. Not his bank, not his obligation, but the people of Detroit trusted the institutions he was associated with, and Hudson would not let that trust be broken. In 1909, he put money into a startup automobile manufacturer. They named the car after him. The Hudson Motor Car Company would eventually become part of American Motors Corporation, then Chrysler. His name would ride on roads all over the world, but it was the store, the building on Woodward, that consumed him. That became his legacy. He never married. He left almost no personal papers. His biographer noted that the details of his private life are few and mostly unknown. What we know is what he built and what he stood for, and that the building on Woodward grew and grew and grew under his watch until it was no longer a store but an institution. He didn't live to see it finished. On July 5, 1912, while on a business trip in England, the country he'd left as a boy of 9, Joseph Lothian Hudson died from a lung ailment. He was 65. His remains were carried across the Atlantic on the RMS Oceanic, then by train from New York to Detroit, where services were held at Central Methodist Church. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. His 4 nephews, James, Joseph, Oscar, and Richard Weber, took over the company. And what they built over the next 3 decades would have astonished even the man who started it. The building didn't happen all at once. It happened the way empires tend to happen, in stages, each one a little more ambitious than the last, each one pushing the walls out a little further, the ceilings a little higher, the vision a little bolder, until one day, you look up and realize that what started as a clothing shop in an opera house has become the tallest department store on earth. Construction began in 1911, the year before the founder's death. The architects were Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, working in the Chicago school style, red brick and granite, built to last. And for the next 35 years, through 2 world wars and a depression and the greatest industrial boom in American history, the building kept growing. 12 separate construction stages, 12 expansions, each one stitching a new wing or a new tower onto the existing structure, connecting buildings that had been built years apart into a single massive complex. By the time the final addition was completed in 1946, the J.L. Hudson Building occupied the entire city block, bounded by Woodward Avenue, Farmer Street, Gratiot Avenue, and Grand River Avenue. The numbers alone are staggering. 25 stories above ground, 2 half floors, a mezzanine, 4 basements sunk beneath the streets of Detroit, 33 levels in all, 410 feet from the second basement to the top of the penthouse tower, plus a 110-foot flagpole rising from the roof. 2,124,316 square feet of floor space, 49 acres under one roof, the second largest department store in America. Only Macy's Herald Square in New York was bigger, and only by 26,000 square feet. But Macy's wasn't 25 stories tall. Nobody was. Hudson's was the tallest department store in the world, and it would hold that title for decades. The facade told you this was a serious building. Red brick above the second floor, polished pink granite below, terracotta cornices and rosettes climbing the walls, ornamental ironwork framing the windows. Frosted glass panes on the mezzanine and the third through fifth floors bore ovals stamped with 3 letters, JLH, the founder's initials, still watching over his store 30 years after his death. 49 large display windows faced the 4 surrounding avenues. 50 more lined the interior corridors, including the Woodward shops on the 7th floor. Each window was a stage set, changed with the seasons, designed to stop pedestrians in their tracks and pull them through the doors. And the doors themselves, brass, revolving, opening onto Woodward Avenue, were the threshold to a world that had no equivalent in Michigan and few in America. Inside, the store required its own infrastructure. 3 transformer centers generated enough electricity to power a city of 20,000. 51 passenger elevators carried shoppers between floors, attended by operators, poised women who called out the departments at each stop. 17 freight elevators moved merchandise. 8 more served employees only. 48 escalators ran continuously from opening to closing, and from the ground floor you could hear them, a low, steady hum that meant the building was alive. Then there was the flag. In 1923, the store unveiled it on Armistice Day. The world's largest American flag hung on the Woodward Avenue facade. 3,700 square feet of stars and stripes. Each star was 5.5 feet tall, each stripe 8 feet wide. The flag measured 235 feet long and 104 feet high, and it took 1 mile of rope to hang it. For decades, it became a civic ritual. Every Armistice Day, every patriotic holiday, a team would unfurl the flag on the building's face, and Detroiters would come downtown just to see it. In 1949, the original was retired and replaced with an even larger version, a 7-story flag that required 55 men to hang it. Its final display was Flag Day, June 1976, for the nation's bicentennial. They closed Woodward Avenue, and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra performed beneath it. Then the flag was donated to the Smithsonian, where it sat in storage because the institution had no way to display something that large. It deteriorated. In 1990, the last owners of the Hudson's name gave permission for the flag to be properly destroyed. But before that, before the flag was folded for the last time, before the store was emptied, before the explosives were loaded into the columns, there was one more thing that Hudson's gave Detroit. Something that outlived the building, outlived the company, outlived even the name. In 1924, the same year Macy's launched its parade in New York, Hudson's sponsored Detroit's first Thanksgiving Day parade. Marching bands, floats, giant character heads bobbing above the crowd, balloons, clowns, costumes. And at the end, rolling down Woodward Avenue, the float that mattered most, Santa Claus, arriving to signal the start of the holiday season. The parade drew hundreds of thousands of spectators to Woodward Avenue every November. At its peak, more than 1 million people lined the route. It was the store's gift to the city, a tradition that began 2 years before Macy's moved their own parade to Thanksgiving, and it would become one of the most beloved rituals in Detroit's history. The parade still exists today. They call it America's Thanksgiving Parade now. Hudson's name is gone from the floats, but it rolls down the same avenue, past the same block where the building once stood. Some traditions are harder to demolish than brick. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what it was like to walk into Hudson's on a Saturday morning in 1955. Not the statistics, you've heard those, the experience. You'd arrive from one of the 4 avenues, most likely Woodward, because Woodward was the address, the prestige entrance, the one with the display windows that changed with every season and stopped you cold on the sidewalk. Brass revolving doors, a doorman. In 1951, his name was Mr. John Williams, and he stood on the Woodward sidewalk in his uniform, greeting customers as if they were arriving at a grand hotel rather than a department store. Inside, the first thing that hit you was the smell. The ground floor was cosmetics and fragrances, exotic perfumes from around the world, a wall of scent that marked the transition from the street to the store. It was the smell of arrival, the smell of being somewhere that wasn't ordinary. Then the sound, 48 1998, escalators humming, elevator bells chiming, the murmur of 1,000 conversations layered over the soft click of heels on polished floors, announcements drifting from overhead speakers. Cash registers ringing, and in the 1950s, those registers rang 100,000 times a day, 200 departments spread across 49 acres, 600,000 items sourced from 16,000 vendors in 40 countries. You could buy a wedding dress on one floor and a washing machine on another. Furniture, jewelry, cosmetics, books. Hudson's had Detroit's largest bookshop, sporting goods, toys, fabrics, kitchenware, shoes, hats, coats, everything. If it existed, Hudson's sold it. The fitting rooms, 705 of them, a world record, were designed for comfort, not just function. The women's lounge on the 4th floor had 85 stalls. A circulating library let you check out books while you shopped. There was a writing lounge, dry cleaning available while you waited. This wasn't a store that sold you things and sent you on your way. This was a store that wanted you to stay. And what kept people coming back, what transformed Hudson's from a large department store into a civic institution, was what happened on the 13th floor. The restaurants, 5 of them, scattered across the upper floors, serving 16,000 meals a day. 10,000 to customers and another 6,000 in the employee cafeteria on 14. But the jewel was the 13th floor dining room, gracious, hushed, white tablecloths, attentive service, and a view over downtown Detroit that made you feel like you'd arrived somewhere important just by sitting down. The menu had 2 items that no one who ate there would ever forget. The first was the Canadian cheese soup. Rich, warm, the kind of thing you ordered when it was January in Michigan and you'd been shopping for 3 hours and needed something that felt like comfort made liquid. The second was the Morris salad. Crisp iceberg lettuce, julienned ham, turkey or chicken, Swiss cheese, gherkins, and a creamy mayo-based dressing that the store eventually bottled and sold. The Maurice salad wasn't invented at Hudson's. Its origins are debated, traced to hotels in New York and Pittsburgh, but it was perfected there. Or at least that's what Detroiters believed, and what Detroiters believed about Hudson's had a way of becoming true. The ritual was always the same. You'd shop for hours, riding those smooth, shiny escalators from floor to floor, browsing the Woodward shops on 7, checking the sales in the basement store where the bargains lived. And then, when your feet ached and your bags were full, you'd ride the escalator up to 13 and order the Maurice salad, maybe the cheese soup, maybe a popover with honey butter, and you'd sit in that hushed room high above the city and feel like the whole world was working exactly the way it should. 30,000 gallons of orange punch left the building every month. Not a typo. 30,000 gallons. Whatever they put in that punch, people couldn't get enough of it. The store didn't just feed you, it made you feel like you belonged somewhere, and that belonging extended to the people who worked there as much as the people who shopped there. By 1953, 12,000 people reported to work at the J.L. Hudson Company's downtown store every day. 12,000. That's not a store, that's a small city. They came from neighborhoods across metropolitan Detroit, and for many of them, Hudson's wasn't just a job, it was a career, a life, an identity. Hudson's was the place to work, a former patron named Elsie Vasich said. Her sister was employed there. Many women wanted jobs at department stores like Hudson's because the work and pay was quite good. A young person could start in the stockroom and rise. The delivery department alone employed 500 drivers, operating 300 trucks, carrying packages to homes across the city and suburbs. The employee cafeteria on the 14th floor served 6,000 meals a day, a restaurant that existed entirely for the people who made the building run. They published their own magazine, The Hudsonian, keeping staff connected across 200 departments and 33 levels. In 1960, the downtown store hired its first African-American employee in a customer-facing role, a high school bus girl named Diana Ross. She wouldn't stay long. She had other plans, but for that moment she was one of the 12,000, clearing tables and dreaming of something bigger, in a building that was itself the biggest thing in Detroit. A year later, in 1961, a 29-year-old named Joseph L. Hudson Jr. became president of the company. He was the founder's grandnephew, and he'd started at the bottom, working on the loading docks of the downtown store in 1950. He knew every floor. He knew the rhythms. He emphasized fashion and special events, and under his leadership, the store pushed deeper into the suburban expansion that would define, and ultimately doom, the empire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the 1950s, what mattered was the pride, the sense that working at Hudson's meant something. You weren't just selling merchandise. You were part of an institution. You wore the uniform, you learned the standards, and when you told people where you worked, it carried weight. If you walked around downtown Detroit and you had a nice green polka dot Hudson's shopping bag, historian Bruce Allen Kopitek wrote, that meant that you were somebody because you just bought something at Hudson's. That bag, green and white striped, the store's signature, shows up in estate sales across Michigan to this day. People kept them, folded them, and tucked them into closets and attic boxes, along with Hudson's charge coins and employee service pins and merchandise still bearing the store's labels. They kept them the way you keep a love letter or a ticket stub from the night everything changed, because the bag was proof that you'd been there, that you'd walked through those brass doors and come out carrying something that meant you belonged, and nothing crystallized that belonging like the holidays. Every November, the Thanksgiving Day parade rolled down Woodward Avenue, Hudson's parade, the one the store had launched in 1924. Marching bands and giant balloon heads and clowns on stilts and elaborate floats carrying characters that children had been waiting all year to see. Hundreds of thousands of spectators lining the route, and in the best years, more than 1 million. The cold air, the packed sidewalks, the smell of roasted chestnuts from street vendors. And at the end, always at the end, the moment every child was waiting for, Santa Claus, riding the final float, arriving to say that Christmas had officially begun. After the parade, the families went inside, into Hudson's, into a building that had been transformed. The display windows on Woodward were winter wonderlands, elaborate scenes that stopped foot traffic on the sidewalk. Mechanical figures moved behind the glass, lights sparkled, children pressed their faces to the windows, and parents lifted toddlers to see, and the whole sidewalk became a processional of families moving from window to window in the cold. Inside, the children's floor became Toyland, decked in holiday decorations, piled with the season's toys, thrumming with the energy of kids who'd just seen Santa and were now walking through a physical catalogue of everything they wanted. Hudson's even operated a children's shopping area where kids could buy gifts for their families without their parents present, a supervised space where a child with a few dollars could feel the adult satisfaction of choosing something, paying for it, and carrying it home in a Hudson's bag. For families who grew up with this ritual, the parade, the windows, the escalator ride to Toyland, the Maurice salad with Mom while Dad carried the bags. Hudson's wasn't a store. It was Christmas. It was the place where the season lived. 94-year-old twins named Mary and Mildred told an interviewer decades later that Hudson's shaped what it meant to grow up in Detroit. From Saturday trips downtown with their mother to modeling in their teens to bringing their own children to see the parade, the store was woven into every stage of their lives. That's what was inside the building when it came down, not just brick and steel and glass. Generations of that. In 1954, the J.L. Hudson Company recorded sales of $163 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's north of $1.25 billion in today's money. 12,000 employees reported to work at the downtown store. 100,000 customers crossed the threshold every day. The restaurant served 16,000 meals from morning to evening. The delivery fleet rolled through every neighborhood in metropolitan Detroit. The building was complete, all 12 stages of construction finished, the tower reaching its full height, the flag flying on Armistice Day, the escalators humming at full capacity. Hudson's was the tallest department store in the world, the second largest in America, and the undisputed center of retail life in Michigan. In 1962, the store posted 2 separate million-dollar sales days, a milestone that seemed to confirm what everyone inside the building already believed, that Hudson's was permanent, that the building on Woodward was as fixed in the life of Detroit as the river that bore the city's name. But 1954 was also the year that Hudson's built the instrument of its own destruction. In March of that year, the company opened a suburban store at Northland Center in Southfield, Michigan, just outside the Detroit city limits. It was the anchor of a brand new shopping mall, and when it opened, Northland was the largest shopping center in the United States. 10,000 parking spaces, free, easy, accessible, no fighting downtown traffic, no circling for a spot on Gratiot, just drive in, park and shop. Northland was a sensation, and Hudson's, seeing the numbers, built more. Eastland Center in 1957, Westland Center in 1965. By 1978, there were 9 satellite Hudson's stores in the metropolitan area, plus several more across the state and in neighboring states. Each one was a success. Each one drew shoppers who might otherwise have driven downtown. And each one, slowly, quietly, was draining the life from the building on Woodward. In 1961, the downtown flagship still accounted for half of the company's total business. That number wouldn't hold. It couldn't hold, because the suburbs were growing, and the parking was free, and the malls were new and bright and clean, and the old downtown was getting harder to reach and harder to park in, and increasingly harder to feel safe in. Hudson's had built the future of American retail, and the future of American retail didn't need a 25-story building on Woodward Avenue. The peak had passed. The numbers were still impressive, but the trajectory had shifted. The line on the graph had bent, subtly, almost imperceptibly, downward. And standing at that height, looking out at what seemed like an invincible empire, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. The decisions that would destroy the downtown store were already being made. They just didn't know it yet. Detroit and Hudson's had always risen together. They were bound, the way a heart is bound to the body that carries it. When the auto industry boomed in the 1920s and the population surged and the money flowed, the building grew. Another wing, another floor, another escalator humming to life. When the city prospered, the store prospered. They shared a bloodstream, which meant that when Detroit started to bleed, so did Hudson's. The decline didn't begin with a single event. It began with a current, slow, deep, pulling in one direction for years before anyone noticed the shoreline had moved. Suburbanization came first. After the Second World War, families left the city in waves. New housing developments rose in Southfield, in Dearborn, in Troy, in Warren, connected to downtown by a growing network of freeways that made the commute possible and the suburbs attractive. Between 1950 and 1960, Detroit lost nearly 20% of its population. The people who'd filled the sidewalks on Woodward Avenue, who'd ridden the escalators and ordered the Morris salad and lined up for the Thanksgiving parade, they were moving to ranch houses with attached garages and backyards that didn't look anything like the city they'd come from, and they took their shopping with them. The suburban malls that Hudson's itself had built, Northland, Eastland, Westland, were pulling customers out of downtown with every passing year. Free parking, clean facilities, no traffic. The irony was precise and merciless. The better Hudson's suburban stores performed, the worse the downtown flagship did. The company was cannibalizing itself, and the math was running in only one direction. Then came 1967. In the early hours of July 23rd, police raided an unlicensed after-hours club on 12th Street, a blind pig in the local parlance. They expected a handful of people. They found 85, celebrating the return of 2 local servicemen from Vietnam. The arrests drew a crowd, a bottle was thrown, and over the next 5 days, Detroit convulsed in the most devastating civil uprising the country had seen in over a century. 43 people died. More than 7,000 were arrested. 1,400 buildings burned. President Johnson sent in the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Tanks rolled through the streets of an American city. The causes ran deep. Decades of housing discrimination, police brutality, deindustrialization that had stripped the city's east side alone of 70,000 jobs in the years after the war, and a simmering resentment that had been building pressure for a generation. The uprising didn't create Detroit's decline, but it accelerated it with a violence that changed the city's trajectory forever. White flight, which had already been underway for years, doubled in 1967 to 40,000 departures. Then it doubled again the following year. The tax base eroded, businesses shuttered. The commercial life of downtown, already weakened by suburban competition, took a blow from which it would never fully recover. And Hudson's, the store on Woodward, the heart of downtown, felt every tremor. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the building got quieter. Not all at once, not in a way that made headlines, but the employees noticed, the floor managers noticed. The escalators still ran, but fewer people were riding them. The restaurants still served the Morris salad, but the tables weren't as full. The parking lots that had once overflowed on Saturdays now had spaces at midday. The city's problems were the store's problems. Rising crime pushed customers toward the suburbs, where the Hudson stores had locked doors and security guards and acres of free parking surrounded by neighborhoods that felt familiar and safe. Downtown felt different now, different than it had in 1955, different than the city Joseph Hudson had bet on when everyone told him Woodward Avenue was too far north. Discount retailers were changing the landscape too. Kmart, Walmart, and their imitators had emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s, offering lower prices in no-frills environments that made a department store's 25 floors of escalators and white tablecloth dining rooms seem like relics of a different century. You didn't need 49 acres of merchandise when a single-story box on a highway could sell you the same washing machine for less. And in 1969, the company made a decision that seemed logical at the time. The Dayton Company of Minneapolis, a successful department store chain in its own right, acquired the J.L. Hudson Company. The merged entity became the Dayton Hudson Corporation, one of the 15 largest non-food retailers in the nation. Hudson's would continue to operate under its own name, semi-autonomously. The stores would expand. The brand would grow, but the center of gravity had shifted. Corporate headquarters moved to Minneapolis. Buying decisions, strategic planning, the allocation of investment, all of it migrated 600 miles west. The people making decisions about the downtown Detroit store increasingly were not the people who'd walked those floors, who knew what that building sounded like when the escalators were running and the registers were ringing and the dining room on 13 was full. A company born in Detroit, built by a man who'd paid his creditors with compound interest because he understood that trust was local, that reputation was personal, that company was now being managed from a city that had never seen the flag unfurl on Woodward Avenue. Nobody set out to destroy Hudson's. That's the thing about tragedies. They rarely begin with villains. They begin with people under pressure, making choices that seem reasonable in the moment, solving one problem while unknowingly creating 10 more. The first decision was the one that looked the most like success. Building the suburban malls, Northland and Eastland and Westland and the rest, was the right call by every measure the retail industry used in the 1950s and 1960s. The suburbs were where the people were going. The parking was free. The formats were modern. Hudson's did what every smart company does. It followed its customers. But following its customers meant leaving its flagship behind. Every dollar spent building a shiny new store in Southfield was a dollar not spent maintaining a 70-year-old building in an increasingly troubled downtown. Every customer who discovered that Northland had everything Woodward had, but with easier parking and no traffic, was a customer who might never ride the downtown escalators again. Hudson's didn't kill its downtown store with malice. It killed it with competence. The suburban stores were excellent. That was the problem. The second decision was the merger. When Dayton Hudson formed in 1969, the logic was impeccable. Scale, national reach, shared buying power, a stronger competitive position against the discount chains that were eating the industry from below. And for the suburban Hudson stores, the merger worked. They expanded into Ohio and Indiana. The brand grew, but for the downtown building, the one that needed investment, that needed attention, that needed someone in a corner office who understood what that particular store meant to that particular city, the merger was a slow disconnection. Minneapolis couldn't feel what Detroit felt. The corporate dashboard showed numbers. Traffic was down, pilferage was up, maintenance costs were rising. The dashboard couldn't show what it meant for a grandmother to take her granddaughter through the same brass doors she'd walked through 50 years earlier. That wasn't a number, but it was the reason the store mattered. The third decision was the one born of paralysis. By 1971, store officials were looking at the math and seeing what the math said. Close the downtown location. Annual pilferage, theft, shrinkage, loss had hit $9 million. The building was immense and aging. The customer base was eroding. The suburban stores were where the growth lived. They couldn't do it. They stayed open, not because the spreadsheets supported it, but because closing the downtown Hudsons would mean something that went beyond retail. It would mean abandoning Detroit. It would mean telling the city that had birthed the company and supported it for 90 years that the company no longer believed in the city's future. City officials would react. Customers would react. The backlash would be severe and personal, so they stayed and they bled. Through the entire 1970s, the downtown store shrank, consolidating selling space, closing floors, reducing departments, cutting staff. By 1978, management proposed a compromise: demolish the massive building and replace it with a smaller 320,000 square foot store as part of a proposed downtown shopping center. That plan died too. No other major retailers were interested in anchoring a downtown Detroit mall. Funding never materialized. The smaller store was never built. What remained was the original building, all 2.2 million square feet of it, operating at a fraction of its capacity, in a downtown that was emptying out, in a city that was losing population and wealth and hope at a rate that made recovery seem impossible. The fourth decision was the inevitable one. On January 17, 1983, after more than 90 years of continuous operation on Woodward Avenue, the J.L. Hudson Company closed its downtown flagship store. It happened at the lowest point of downtown Detroit's modern decline. The city's population had cratered. The auto industry was in crisis. Unemployment was staggering. The streets around the store that had once buzzed with 100,000 daily shoppers were quieter than Joseph Hudson could have imagined when he'd gambled on that Woodward Avenue location in 1891. The doors closed. The escalators stopped. The registers went silent. And the building, the tallest department store in the world, the place that had held the world's largest flag and launched the city's Thanksgiving parade and served 16,000 meals a day, stood empty on Woodward Avenue. Almost. It wasn't abandoned overnight. That's an important distinction, and one that got lost in the telling. After the store closed in January 1983, 1,100 corporate employees remained in the building. Hudson's maintained its headquarters staff in the big store even after the retail floors went dark. A new lobby and security entrance were added on the Farmer Street side. No longer the grand Woodward entrance, but a side door, functional, stripped of ceremony. The building was still alive technically. Its heart had stopped, but it was still breathing. In May 1984, the J.L. Hudson Company formally merged into the department store division of the Dayton Hudson Corporation. All executive and buying positions transferred to Minneapolis. Staff who remained moved to the Northland store in Southfield. Floor by floor, the downtown building emptied. The last corporate department to leave was credit operations. They moved out in October 1986. After that, the upper floors were dark. The escalators didn't run. The restaurants didn't serve. The fitting rooms, 705 of them, stood empty. In December 1989, Dayton Hudson sold the building to Southwestern Associates of Windsor, Ontario, and then the building was truly vacant. Historian Michael Hauser would later push back against the narrative that Hudson's had sat empty for 15 years before its demolition. Various media sources wanted the public to believe that Hudson's had been vacant for 15 years, he said, when in actuality it was 8 years, which, by Detroit standards, is a relatively short period of time compared to many other large vacant structures in the city that have been idle for decades. 8 years. But 8 years in a building that size, in a city struggling as Detroit was struggling, is enough. Windows broke, trespassers explored the empty floors, water damage crept in. The vast interior spaces that had once held 200 departments and 705 fitting rooms and 5 restaurants and 48 escalators and 51 elevators, and the memories of every family that had ever visited, those spaces sat in darkness, collecting dust and silence. Several developers pitched redevelopment proposals. They all failed. The building's sheer scale, 2.2 million square feet built in 12 stages over 35 years, with no complete set of structural drawings in existence, made every renovation project financially impossible. The cost of bringing it back to life exceeded the value of anything it could become. And so the argument shifted. The building's defenders said it was historic, irreplaceable, a monument to Detroit's golden age. The building's opponents said it was a hulking obstruction, a sun-blocking, block-long symbol of decay that was strangling downtown's chance at revival. Tear it down, they said. Clear the site. Build something new. The opponents won. The city decided to demolish the J.L. Hudson building as part of a broader redevelopment plan for downtown. The vision was called Campus Martius, mid-rise office buildings, a hotel, restaurants, shops, a public park, and it required removing the massive, decaying structure that dominated the block. They hired the best in the business. Controlled Demolition, Incorporated, CDI, a family firm recognized as the founders of the commercial implosion industry. Marc Loiseau, CDI's president, surveyed the building and called it the greatest dynamic structural control challenge his company had ever faced. The problems were enormous. 12 different construction stages meant 12 different structural configurations, different column types, different bay widths, different failure characteristics. No structural drawings existed for the complete building. CDI had to investigate the structure from the inside, mapping what 3.5 decades of piecemeal construction had produced. Homrich/NASDI sent a 21-man crew, 3 months to investigate, 4 months to prepare. The lower 2 basements were filled with engineered fill. Perimeter walls were reinforced with Burmed soil to prevent collapse under hydrostatic pressure once the building's internal structure was removed. Before any of that, there was the asbestos. The abatement project was the largest in Midwest history. 270 workers stripping deadly material from a building that had been built across an era when nobody understood what asbestos would do to the people who breathed it. Then the explosives crew arrived. CDI's 12-person loading team took 24 days to place 4,118 separate charges in 1,100 locations on columns across 9 levels of the complex. 36,000 feet of detonating cord, 4,512 non-electric delay elements, 2,728 pounds of explosives, 36 primary implosion sequences, 216 micro-delays designed to control the detonation overpressure. All of it, the investigation, the preparation, the engineering, the asbestos removal, the loading, pointed toward a single moment. One button, one sequence, 30 seconds, October 24th, 1998. The date was chosen. The time was chosen more carefully. 5:47 p.m., the store's traditional closing time. Even in death, they gave Hudson's the courtesy of closing at the usual hour. 50,000 people came to watch. They gathered at Hart Plaza, at the foot of Woodward Avenue, on the steps of the Wayne County Building, in the windows of surrounding offices, across the Detroit River in Windsor, Ontario, on rooftops and overpasses, and in the beds of pickup trucks parked on side streets with sightlines to the tower. Mayor Dennis Archer pressed the button. The rest you already know: the thunderclaps, the quivering glass, the wobble, the hesitation, the collapse, the tower twisting sideways, the roar, the cheers that lasted a moment and then didn't, the dust cloud, 300 feet high, swallowing downtown Detroit, the silence after. 30 seconds, a building that took 35 years to build, destroyed in the time it takes to tie your shoes. And when the dust cleared, when the gray powder settled on every car and lamppost and windowsill for blocks in every direction, what was left was a 60-foot pile of rubble weighing 660 million million. Where a palace had stood that morning, there was now a wound. They said the wound would heal quickly. The plans were ambitious. Campus Martius, a mixed-use development, office buildings, a hotel, shops, restaurants. The rubble would be cleared in 5 or 6 months. Construction would follow. The block where Hudson's had stood would become something new. Different, yes, but alive. The argument that had justified the implosion, that the decaying building was an obstacle to revival, would be proven right by what replaced it. Here's what actually happened. In 2001, 3 years after the implosion, the city constructed an underground parking garage on the site, 955 spaces across 4 levels, built using parts of the demolished tower's basement. Steel girders poked above a concrete expanse at street level, supports designed for a future building that had not yet been funded, designed, or approved. And there it sat, the Hudson's block, the block that had held the tallest department store in the world, where 12,000 people had gone to work, and 100,000 had gone to shop, and 1 million had watched the parade roll past, was a parking garage, a flat, grey expanse of concrete in the heart of downtown, dotted with steel posts pointing at the sky like the ribs of something that had been gutted. The $500 million development that was supposed to justify the demolition never materialized. Not in 2001, not in 2005, not in 2010. The parking garage, intended as a temporary placeholder, became permanent. Year after year, Detroiters drove over the spot where the brass doors had been, parked their cars on the ground where the escalators had hummed, and walked away to wherever they were actually going. Meanwhile, the name was being erased. In 2000, Dayton Hudson Corporation renamed itself Target Corporation, taking the name of its discount chain, the business unit that had surpassed the department stores in size and profitability. A year later, every remaining Hudson store, the suburban locations, the ones in Ohio and Indiana, was rebranded as Marshall Field's, a name Target had acquired when it purchased that Chicago chain. The Hudson signs came down. The green and white bags disappeared. 120 years of brand identity wiped clean. Then Marshall Field's was sold to May Department Stores in 2004 for $3.24 billion. 2 years later, Federated Department Stores acquired May and folded everything into Macy's. The chain that had been Hudson's, then Marshall Field's, was now Macy's. Today, if you type hudsons.com into a browser, it redirects to target.com. That's what's left of the name. But Detroit itself, the city that had declined alongside its greatest store, was writing a different ending. The same year the parking garage was built, Campus Martius Park began to take shape on the surrounding blocks. It opened in 2004 and became what its designers had hoped, a genuine public gathering space, a downtown anchor, a place where Detroiters came by choice. The park worked even though the Hudson's block remained a gap in the skyline. The city's recovery was slow, painful, and far from complete. Detroit filed for bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. But investment was trickling back. Dan Gilbert's Quicken Loans had moved to downtown. Buildings were being rehabilitated. People were returning to streets that had been empty for decades. And in 2013, Bedrock Detroit, Gilbert's real estate company, was granted development rights to the 2-acre Hudson site. It took 4 more years to break ground. In December 2017, construction began on what would become Hudson's Detroit, a mixed-use complex designed by shop architects featuring a 49-story tower rising to 681 feet and a 12-story office building. The tower would become the second tallest building in Detroit and in Michigan. The project was complicated and delayed. The original timeline called for opening in 2024. The office building was completed in 2025. The tower is expected to open in 2027. The total cost has exceeded $1 billion. But what stands there now? What's rising on the exact block where Joseph Hudson opened his first building in 1891? Where the tallest department store in the world stood for most of the 20th century, where the brass doors opened onto Woodward and the flag unfurled on Armistice Day, is something. General Motors has relocated its global headquarters to the building. The company moved in during January of 2026, returning to Woodward Avenue, not far from where it all began. JP Morgan Chase, Accenture, office workers filling the floors again. A 7-story atrium lets natural light fall through the center of the structure. There's an event space called the Department at Hudson's, 56,000 square feet across 3 floors. In the kitchen, they serve a modern version of the Morris salad. Behind the bar, they mix a cocktail called the Orange Punch Parchment, an homage to the drink that moved 30,000 gallons a month through the original store. The main entrance to the office building is called Entrance 1. In the original Hudson's, that was the employee entrance on Farmer Street, the door where 12,000 workers arrived every morning. Between the tower and the office building, there's a pedestrian plaza called Nick Gilbert Way, named for Dan Gilbert's late son. It's designed for public events, live music, art installations, pop-ups, gatherings. A gathering space on a block that has been, in one form or another, a gathering space since 1891. It's not the same. It can't be the same. The old building, the red brick and pink granite, the terracotta rosettes, the JLH ovals on the frosted glass, the escalators and elevators and fitting rooms and toyland, and the 13th floor dining room is gone. It was reduced to £660 million of rubble on a Saturday evening in October, and no amount of glass and steel and good intentions can reconstruct what those walls held. But something stands where nothing stood for 20 years. That means something too, even if what it means is complicated. The building is gone. It has been gone for more than a quarter century, but the building was never really what mattered. The building was brick and steel and glass. What mattered was what happened inside it. What mattered was what people carried out through those brass revolving doors, not in their shopping bags, but in themselves. A grandmother taking her granddaughter to see Santa in Toyland for the first time. A young woman in 1960 clearing tables in the dining room who would one day sing to the world. 12,000 employees who didn't say they had a job at a department store. They said they were Hudson's people. A family on a Saturday morning, riding the escalators floor by floor, the kids running ahead, the parents carrying bags. Everyone knowing that the next stop was the 13th floor and the Maurice salad and the Canadian cheese soup, and that feeling, that specific, unrepeatable feeling of being somewhere that was built for you. Those things can't be imploded. At estate sales across Michigan, people still find the bags, green and white striped. Hudson's, they find the charge coins and the service pins and the boxes with the store's name on them. They find recipes for the Maurice salad, handwritten on index cards, passed from mother to daughter to granddaughter. Dozens of restaurants across metropolitan Detroit still serve their own version of the salad. At the Hudson Cafe on Woodward, at Carl's, at Side Street Diner in Grosse Pointe. The dressing is the thing. Everyone has their own recipe. Everyone says theirs is closest to the original. The Thanksgiving Day Parade still rolls down Woodward Avenue every November. They call it America's Thanksgiving Parade now. The Hudson's name is long gone from the floats, but it's the same avenue, the same route, the same tradition that the store created in 1924, 2 years before Macy's moved their own parade to Thanksgiving. The parade has outlived the store, it's outlived the company, it's outlived the building. Some things endure, and the new building rises on the same block. Glass and steel instead of red brick and granite, offices and a hotel instead of 200 departments and 705 fitting rooms, but rising on the same ground, at the same address, carrying the same name, Hudson's, as if the name still means something, as if it still can. Maybe it does, or maybe what matters isn't the name on the building. Maybe what matters is the name on the recipe card. The one in the kitchen drawer in the handwriting you recognize that says Maurice salad, Mom's version, and lists the ingredients the way she always made it, with the dressing she swore was exactly like the one on 13. Joseph Hudson was a man who went bankrupt, lost his father, moved to a city where he knew almost no one, and built a shop on a street nobody thought would amount to much. 7 years later, he tracked down every person he owed money to and paid them back in full, with interest, because he believed that what you built meant nothing if you didn't honor what you owed. His building stood for 107 years. It died in 30 seconds. The dust that engulfed downtown Detroit on that October evening in 1998 carried more than brick and mortar. It carried the particular smell of the perfume counter on the first floor, the memory of escalators humming 7 days a week, the sound of 100,000 cash registers ringing on a Saturday, the weight of a green polka dot shopping bag in the hand of someone who felt, for the length of a Saturday afternoon, like they belonged to something bigger than themselves. The cheering stopped, the dust settled, the hole in the skyline opened up and stayed open for 20 years. But somewhere in a kitchen in Dearborn or Royal Oak or Grosse Pointe, someone is mixing mayo and lemon juice and a little sugar, slicing Swiss cheese into thin strips, arranging gherkins just so, and they're making the salad the way their mother made it, who made it the way her mother made it, who ate it for the first time on the 13th floor of a building that doesn't exist anymore. The building is gone. What it held isn't.